Welcome to We Dissent, the podcast with secular women attorneys discussing religious liberty issues in our federal and state courts and our work to keep religion and government separate. I'm Rebecca Markert with Americans United for Separation of Church and State.
And I'm Liz Cavell with the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Today we're going to talk about what's been happening in Washington, D.C., in our government since Trump was inaugurated in January. Obviously, a lot has been going on. We're going to discuss the executive orders that have dominated the news since then. We're also going to talk about some of the legislation that we're tracking in Congress. We'll also end with a survey of some of the bills that we're starting to see in state legislatures.
To help us with this discussion, we are so excited to be joined by one of my brilliant colleagues at AU, Dena Sher. Dena Sher is the Associate Vice President for Public Policy at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. She helps direct AU's state and federal legislative and policy work, focusing on blocking efforts to use religion to undermine people's rights. Previously, she served as AU's State Legislative Council, coordinating our advocacy in state legislatures and before state school boards. She started with AU as an Equal Justice Works Fellow in their legal department. Dena also worked in the ACLU's Washington Legislative Office, lobbying on religious freedom issues. Prior to attending law school, Dena lobbied on behalf of nonprofits working in international development. Welcome to the show, Dena.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Some of the major news from the last couple of months have really centered around President Trump signing all of these executive orders. Before we get into some of the orders that are of interest to our organizations because they touch on religious liberty, it's really worth a refresher on what an executive order is. A lot of our listeners might not actually know what it means to sign an executive order. So Dena, can you please explain executive orders? What are they, and how are they different or similar to presidential proclamations?
Sure. Executive orders are instructions from the president directing executive branch agencies, so the federal departments and their staff, to take specific actions. Every president, from George Washington to Donald Trump, have signed executive orders, and they each have a number. So we are at about 14,200 of them in the last almost 250 years.
Wow.
Presidential proclamations, on the other hand, are generally ceremonial or celebratory, like in honor of Black History Month.
Do the executive orders have the force of law, and how do they work?
Yes, executive orders do have the force of law, but it's important to remember that no president can issue an executive order that violates the Constitution or our laws or our fundamental rights. Executive orders must be grounded in what the president's powers are that are set out in the Constitution. Sometimes they take effect immediately, but more often they instruct an agency to act within a set amount of time, like 60 or 90 days. And the instructions can be things like put out new regulations, or a little bit vaguer, come up with a plan to do something. And again, it's important to remember what executive orders can't do. They can't repeal federal law, they can't contradict court rulings, and they can't call for actions that Congress must take. So I'm sure we've all heard that there might be an executive order coming to close down the Department of Education. But Congress created the Department of Education in 1979, and thus Congress would be the branch of our government that would have to vote to close it down. But I think it's important to say what the goals of a lot of these executive orders are. President Trump is using the executive orders not just to dictate how he wants the federal government to work, but also to use his power to signal to his base, to spread misinformation, attack marginalized communities, threaten punishments to get states, government-funded schools and hospitals, and even private companies to toe the line and ultimately to rob people of their rights, their safety, and their well being.
There's been a deluge of executive orders coming down from the Trump administration this year, and this was to be expected. Liz, you and I have talked about this on previous shows. We knew that these types of executive orders were coming because they're a direct result of what was laid out in Project 2025.
Right. And it's the weirdest thing. The Trump campaign just disavowed at every turn Project 2025. They never heard of it. They never read it. They have nothing to do with it. Yet we're 5-6 weeks into the Trump administration, and Project 2025 is actually very closely shaping the agenda of the Trump administration across the board. And a lot of this, most of this, is happening through, as much of Project 2025 focused on, through executive orders.
So, we're going to talk about a lot of the different executive orders that Trump has signed already, but we're going to narrow in on some of the ones that you probably haven't heard a lot about in the news. The two that specifically touch on religious liberty issues are of obviously most importance to us. So, the first one we want to talk about is the executive order establishing the White House Faith Office. This was an executive order that was announced during the National Prayer Breakfast at the beginning of February. It was signed a day later on February 7th. And what this executive order does is it establishes the White House Faith Office. This is renaming a previous iteration of this same office, the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, or the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. Some important things to note from the text of the executive order is that this office would, quote, coordinate with agencies on identifying and promoting grant opportunities for nonprofit faith-based entities, community organizations, and houses of worship, especially those inexperienced with public funding, but that operate effective programs. It also will work in collaboration with the Attorney General to identify concerns raised by faith-based entities, community organizations, and houses of worship about any failures of the executive branch to enforce constitutional and federal statutory protections for religious liberty. It's also tasked with identifying and proposing means to reduce burdens on the free exercise of religion, including legislative, regulatory, and other barriers to the full and active participation of faith-based entities, community organizations, and houses of worship in government-funded or government-conducted activities and programs.
So what this all basically boils down to is a narrative that religious entities and religious actors are facing persecution and discrimination everywhere and violations of their free exercise rights. And we're going to turn this executive office to the task of rooting out and undoing all of this persecution that religionists are facing.
So, Dena, I had mentioned up top that this is not a new office. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the White House Faith Office? When did it start, and what does the office do?
Sure. The White House Faith Office, or under whatever name it's had, dates back to the George W. Bush administration. He promoted on his campaign something he called compassionate conservatism. That belief was that faith-based organizations can do a better job of helping people than secular ones or the government. But kind of key to that was that they were going to instill faith, and that was the key to their success. And so kind of like what Liz talked about, right? The whole there was a narrative that there were barriers in place for faith-based organizations to participate in these government programs. So the purpose of the office was to encourage faith-based organizations by clearing the way for them, taking away the barriers, leveling the playing field for them to obtain government funding to provide social services. So the office led the effort to put in place regulations at multiple federal agencies that were responsible for billions of dollars of grants for things like food banks, homeless and domestic violence shelters, job training, elder care, you name it, our social safety net. Um, and as you might have guessed from Liz's lead in, these regulations were seen as radical at the time. They were designed to strip away key church state separation protections that had applied to partnerships between the government and faith based organizations for decades. The Bush era regulations made it easier for these faith based organizations that were deemed more successful to proselytize to those who seek services. Um, so they could display religious iconography and scripture in spaces where these services were taking place. They also allowed these taxpayer funded organizations to discriminate in hiring, so they could refuse to hire anyone they viewed as the wrong religion or the wrong faith. At the same time, though, it's important to remember that many operatives in the Bush White House decided that the faith based office was really just useful for political purposes. So, in the lead up to the 2004 elections, many of the events that the office hosted happened to be in swing states or were aimed at co opting influential faith leaders. President Obama kept the office but recognize some of the flaws that had existed under the Bush administration. He appointed an advisory committee of outside experts to recommend how to revamp the regulations. And that was done so that whatever was in place would protect the religious freedom of people who rely on the government funded social services, right? Like that's what these rules should be about. The regulations helped ensure that people in need would not be forced to participate in religious activities or required to meet a religious litmus test to get critical services. So then Trump comes in. Not surprisingly, he unwound the religious freedom protections and instead put in place regulations designed to give religious exemptions to organizations that got taxpayer funds to deliver the services. And then it changed again with Biden. They returned to centering the needs of people who got the services and protected their religious freedom. And then I think, Rebecca, you asked what the office does. Over time, the perception of the office changed, definitely. It shed the view that it was handing out funding to religious organizations or was just a political operation. So, under the Biden administration, the office would do a lot of outreach to all kinds of organizations and communities, not just faith based organizations, and encourage them in their ongoing work in their communities. They would guide them to resources and they would provide information. So, following a disaster, the office would be a conduit of information from the government to organizations that were serving their communities or, provided important updates during COVID. So it became another important way to deliver information to their communities and build trust.
We want to talk a little bit about what Trump's new office is going to look like. But before we do that, I want to talk about Paula White. So after Trump established this office through the executive order back in February, he tapped televangelist Paula White Cain to run the office. And as our listeners may know, she's a televangelist, a pastor from Florida. Her church is Story Life Church. And she is also the president of Paula White Ministries and has always been known and identified as a personal friend and the minister to Donald Trump. She's actually credited with converting Trump to Christianity, and she was one who delivered the invocation at the first inauguration and was actually, that was a historical moment because she was the first woman clergy member to deliver the invocation at a presidential inauguration.
So Paula White is back in her old position because she was also the head of the faith-based office in Trump's first administration. And it's no surprise that she's coming back to run this office a second time. So she recently tweeted this time around, "I've been appointed to lead the White House Faith Office. The office will work alongside Attorney General Pam Bondi to combat discrimination against Christians in federal institutions and ensure religious liberties are upheld across the country." Again, the whole narrative this time around is Christian persecution. The government needs to step in and do something about all the discrimination that Christians, the majority religion in this country, are facing. And let's use the government to do that, obviously pointing to the Justice Department and the Attorney General.
Dena, do you think that the second iteration of Trump's version of this office is a radical shift in how the office has been used in the past?
When I read the executive order, it reminded me a lot of what was going on in the Bush administration, but kind of just turned the volume up. And then there was some Project 2025 sprinkled in. And yes, I am worried about what the office could do, but I want to kind of piggyback on what you both were explaining about Paula White, is just to remember that when she was the director last time around, the office essentially disappeared for 4 years. Nothing really happened.
You mean she's not a diligent government worker?
Not that I saw last time. How's that?
Right. Well, she's also a very busy prosperity gospel preacher on TV. So she's got other gigs.
Exactly. She's got to run her televangelist ministry. She's got daily television shows. She's right now as we record this, hosting a very big conference. And, she still is a pastor at a church. She's got a busy life. So Rebecca explained some of the troubling aspects of the executive order. There's obvious aim to favor religion, right? The office is now just the faith office. Forget about any other organizations that serve their communities. And the office is tasked with building the capacity of faith-based and only faith-based organizations to get federal funding. So that means that they're going to do outreach and training for very small religious organizations and churches who don't already get federal grants. They are so small that they've never had a federal grant in the past. They're going to tell them about the grants and theoretically train them to ensure they are ready to take responsibility for implementing a grant. Because there's a lot that goes with it, right? There's reporting requirements and oversight and accounting practices. And, like a 2-person nonprofit, that's never had those kind of requirements in place before. It's hard to do. And because it's so hard, I can't actually imagine that's what's going to happen. Just kind of flashback again, the Bush administration tried something like this. It was called the Compassion Capital Fund, and they gave out small grants to organizations, but it really ended up being a bit of a mess. It went to religious programming. It was otherwise misspent. And this part of the executive order reminded me of that program a lot. There's other things that we could talk about in the executive order. I think it'll prompt another round of regulations that will, again, put the interests of the taxpayer-funded organizations ahead of the needs and rights of the people who get services. And then the executive order also calls on the office to work on a whole range of issues that are straight out of Project 2025. Biblically based families, reliance on work and self-sufficiency, wholesome education, whatever that means, and then combating anti-Christian bias.
That brings us to the next executive order that touches on the work that our organizations do, and that is the executive order eradicating anti-Christian bias.
This reminds me, remember way back when and maybe it wasn't housed in the faith office because I remember Jeff Sessions having something to do with it. But I remember there was like the Religious Freedom Task Force.
Religious Liberty Task Force.
Yeah, Religious Liberty Task Force last time. And it was the subject of a ton of jokes, and many of them revolved around Jeff Sessions. But I do think this is kind of resurrecting that from the last Trump administration, and then again just turning it up 1,000%.
That task force didn't actually do anything, did it? Like, I don't remember it being very active.
Not that I really remember, but again, this is all like signaling. So, eradicating anti Christian bias, again, announced the same time at the National Prayer Breakfast on February 6th and signed along with the faith based office EO. It has a stated purpose and policy of, I'm like semi quoting here, to protect religious freedoms of Americans and end the anti Christian weaponization of government, right? Just the thing that is not actually happening. The founders, I'm quoting again, established a nation in which people were free to practice their faith without fear of discrimination or retaliation by their government. The previous administration, this is their words, the Biden administration, engaged in an egregious pattern of targeting peaceful Christians while ignoring violent anti-Christian offenses. Again, this is just far-right misinformation about this narrative of Christian persecution in this country and in government. But here it is showing up as the purpose and policy of an executive order. So Trump is claiming that his administration is going to ensure that any unlawful and improper conduct or policies, practices that target Christians are identified and terminated and rectified. So this is a warning to all of those out there persecuting Christians that they're going to find them and punish them. But it also establishes a task force, we'll see what they're tasked with, but a task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias. And I think it's going to be a pretty easy job. So maybe Dena knows. I don't really know what the anti-Christian bias task force will be asked to do or if that's been fleshed out, but I kind of see it as symbolic of just this narrative.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, Liz. I think it is signaling to the base, propelling misinformation. It's a DOJ, Department of Justice led government task force, so it involves representatives from lots of different agencies, and they're supposed to unearth policies that are deemed anti-Christian. Um, and it says it's going to focus on things that they call unlawful policies, but you read through in detail that they're just going to go beyond that because they want to target so-called anti-Christian conduct by the government and by private actors, right?
Right.
And given the executive order's alignment with Project 2025, it seems like that's a ready-made playbook for them to just, they know what people say is anti-Christian bias because that's what's in the playbook, right?
Mm-hmm.
All they have to do is just go through that, identify those policies, and then, make a recommendation or essentially for greenlighting discrimination.
Right. And Rebecca and I have talked about this in so many other contexts, but this gets back at this insidious part of the Christian Nationalist Project that is taking minority protections, like in the Bill of Rights, that's supposed to protect minority viewpoints from the tyranny of the majority, and inverting it to be a protection for majoritarian privilege. So, for example, it's Christian persecution to say that the separation of church and state exists and it prevents the government from funding Catholic school, right? Like that's persecution of Christians and it's hostile to religion because it's this principle that actually protects the rest of us who don't want to fund a religion in which we don't believe with our tax dollars, as our founders saw fit. It protects the rest of us, but it doesn't privilege the majority religion. Therefore, it's hostile, it's discrimination, it's bias, it's persecution. And it's the same thing with having Christian or religious believers follow laws that regulate their religiously motivated conduct, like civil rights laws and anti-discrimination laws that have been on the books since the civil rights era that regulate all of American citizens' conduct, whether religiously motivated or not. So, for example, I don't want to serve Black people in my restaurant. I don't want to serve gay people in my cake shop. If it's religiously motivated, all of a sudden that law is hostile to me and it's biased against me and it's persecuting me because my religion tells me the races shouldn't eat together and gay people shouldn't marry each other and celebrate with cake.
Yeah, I mean, it just turns the whole notion of discrimination on its head. And it takes what Religious freedom it's a shield that protects all of our rights. And that's kind of how we've always viewed it through history. And it just turns that shield into a sword to harm others. And this task force, I fear, is gonna kind of set out the blueprint to do that government wide.
Well, how expansive do you think the reach of this task force will be?
So the attorney general, as I said, is going to chair the task force. And then the executive order listed more than a dozen federal agencies who will also serve on the task. The agencies will be represented on the task force. Those agencies are responsible for enforcing civil rights laws and implementing billions of dollars in taxpayer programs. So it could be like a really broad reach. But then curiously, it also includes like the Small Business Administration, the
Oh,
ambassador to the UN, the Treasury Department, Russ Vogt at OMB, but also at Project 2025 infamy, and probably Paula White. What I noticed as I was reading back through the list, it does not include USAID. USAID was already on the way, sadly, to being put out of business.
but I just want to stress so many of these executive orders and initiatives that we're talking about, down to the dismantling of USAID, is literally like word to word overlay of what Project 2025 envisioned. When we're talking about and thinking back to how unpopular Project 2025 was during this campaign and how roundly disavowed it was by the campaign, so many of these initiatives are actually coming straight out of, and if you look at them side by side, if you remember, Project 2025 kind of went through agency by agency with its policy recommendations. And all these executive orders are pretty closely tracking they have some twin in Project 2025, just policy by policy.
And it really is not surprising because we knew last year Project 2025 said they were going to do this and that and the other thing. And this has been incredibly organized. I think that's a also major difference from the first Trump administration, where things seem to be going much slower. Things are going much faster this time around because they had a plan and they're implementing it. And it is going according to the book. So let's talk about what this executive order means in real life. You kind of talked about it a little bit about like USAID, but let's talk a little bit about what the impact of this task force could be in real life.
I think if you look at the misleading examples that we talked about earlier and how they got twisted and what it means in reality, you'll get a sense for what I think the task force is going to do. Trump used these misleading examples in the executive order to justify the task force. And some of them were, he said he wants to protect the religious liberty of foster care agencies. What does that mean? That means that he wants to authorize taxpayer-funded foster care agencies to impose a religious litmus test to turn away Catholic, Jewish, LGBTQ plus families who want to provide children with loving homes. But if you put the religious beliefs of these taxpayer-funded organizations above the best interests of children in foster care, you are going to cause them harm. Another thing he talked about as, this misleading justification was to get rid of guidance that imposes gender ideology on employers. It's nonsense, right? Like what he wants to do is allow employers and coworkers to discriminate against people in the workplace in the name of religion. He wants to target guidance that outlines protections for employees from illegal harassment. All the guidance does is serve as a reminder of employers' obligations not to engage in workplace harassment, right? How not to disrespect their workers. So, stopping offensive comments about someone's appearance, or stopping sexist remarks, or intentionally and repeatedly calling someone by the wrong name or the wrong gender. But that's what Trump wants to allow. That's what he used to justify the existence of this task force. So I think those are two really good examples of the kinds of harms that we could see, right? Like the task force can't implement things, but they can make recommendations. They can create the blueprint. They can, put together the roadmap. And that's the kind of harms that are going to result once they're implemented.
Right. And again, the whole fiction is that all of those federal regulations and guidance that tells employees what their rights are and tells employers what their legal obligations are, all of that is actually hostile and discriminatory towards employees that want to harass people or bully people in the name of their religion, misgender people in the workplace, make comments or remarks that would be considered sexist or homophobic because it's motivated by their religion. They're being discriminated against by being prevented from behaving that way in the workplace. It's absurd.
Sometimes it's a little bit of a, cake and eat it too kind of legal theory, right? Like they want to be treated equally in order to get access to government funds or whatever, but then they want to be treated specially and not have all the rules apply to them.
That's right. They want all the privileges, but none of the obligations of the social contract, the civil laws, all of the things we as citizens under the civil law share. It's
Right,
privilege.
exactly. Yep, yep.
Oi. Let's move on to a couple other of the recently signed executive orders just to kind of see how this is playing out in some other contexts. Let's start with education.
Yeah. So these are some executive orders that, again, don't explicitly touch on religious liberty issues, but will have some sort of impact or effect, I think, especially on education, which both of our organizations, Americans United and the Freedom from Religion Foundation, get a lot of church state separation complaints about religion in the public schools. And so any of the EOs that have come down about education are ones that we're also closely looking at because there will probably be some sort of impact on religious liberty rights of students and teachers in our public schools. So the first one that we want to talk about is the one that is about indoctrination. On January 29th, Trump signed an executive order ending radical indoctrination in K through 12 schooling. This executive order bans the use of federal funds to support what it calls gender ideology and discriminatory equity theories like critical race theory. It also reestablishes the 1776 Advisory Commission and creates the commission within the Department of Education to implement programs for teaching patriotic curricula in preparation for next year's 250th anniversary of American independence. I wonder if that means then we'll have the Department of Education for at least another year, maybe? Dena, do you know anything about this indoctrination EO?
Sure. Again, it doesn't do anything right now. It calls on several different federal departments like the Department of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services to identify all the funding sources and streams that go to support our public schools. So there's funding that goes to K-12 curriculum, instruction, activities, teacher education, certification, training, and then they need to consider whether there is any of that funding that goes to support what they deem indoctrination and social transitioning of students. And then the agencies have to come up with a plan to prevent the distribution of that funding to the schools. It is important to know that if they would follow the rules that exist, this would be a very long process and that there's lots of safeguards in place for schools to ensure that they don't lose all of their federal funding. They have due process rights if some of their federal funding is threatened. But, that's kind of like the nuts and bolts. And I don't know that that's necessarily the main point, right? I think there are two things at play. First, this was designed to have an immediate chilling effect. So it's not entirely clear how the government is going to enforce it. As I just said, it's like a maze to figure out how they could enforce it. But that's not how things get enforced. Schools don't know what to do. Teachers are even worried about whether they can sponsor a student-led Gay Straight Alliance club. And to be clear, many schools want to protect their students, their families, their teachers. And many schools know that you can't dictate what can or can't be discussed in the classroom because that would be a First Amendment violation. And many schools are aware that there are federal laws that bar federal involvement in picking out what curriculum is taught in public schools. But at the same time, schools know that they can't put their funding at risk, right? Because that puts all the students at a different kind of risk. So they have to be really careful. And that's how you get to this chilling effect. And the other thing is, it's just another way to attack public schools, right? And to pave the way for private school vouchers. These are attacks that have been ginned up by anti-public school groups and politicians and Christian nationalists. And the whole idea is that they create these fake controversies over books and curriculum and policies, all designed to sow distrust in our public schools. Guess what? Critical race theory isn't really being taught in our public schools.
You don't say.
Instead, yeah, exactly. It's part of a big effort to just undermine public schools and put in place a different system. So, funding private school vouchers, or the case in Oklahoma that created the nation's first religious public charter school. That is what happens when their plan is set into motion. They gin up false controversies and they create distrust, and people feel like they need alternatives to our public schools.
Right. And it's all in the title, right? It's the Orwellian piece of this. It's the order to stop the indoctrination of children in our schools. Again, it's part of this false narrative. Everything in secular society is a big evil campaign to indoctrinate people and indoctrinate kids and be biased and hostile to religious believers and discriminate against them. And of course, it's just an inversion of the reality of being in the majority, which is you would enjoy enormous privilege, and there are laws and movements, and our Bill of Rights is set up this way to scale back your privilege and make minority groups more equal as time goes on. And it's just this false narrative that's the backlash to that. And then, of course, undermining public schools is always part of the project.
Yeah. And I mean, I also think it's really important to think about what are they really, they're attacking kids who are trans, and they don't want an accurate history of our country taught. And how does that make kids feel? There are challenges out there to book bans bringing both equal protection claims and First Amendment speech claims, because it does undermine everyone's equal protection under law, to treat them differently, to say that they're not welcome, to single them out for really bad treatment in their public schools that are open and welcoming of everyone, or are supposed to be.
Yeah, the chilling effect and the sowing of fear, too, is also really insidious. It reminds me when you were talking, Dena, of remember when Florida, the legislature, obviously not an executive order, but when they passed their Don't Say Gay law, and all the coverage was about don't say gay. What does it mean? What does it cover? What do parents and students of LGBTQ students or kids do? Is it safe to be here? What do teachers do? Who's going to get in trouble for being supportive of gay students. And it just is sowing fear and confusion amongst these minority groups. And that's the point.
Exactly.
It's also just like deeply ironic and hypocritical because on the one hand, they don't want us to be quote unquote indoctrinating into all of these different like woke agenda items. But at the same time, they're pushing across the country laws that actually do indoctrinate people into religion, you know, posting the 10 Commandments up in schools, pushing for chaplains to be part of public school personnel and injecting more prayer into schools. And so I find it also just to be deeply ironic because of the name of this particular EO, but also like it's just really creating from childhood the ideal American who is a specific person that just so happens to be white, Christian, and
cis and straight.
right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, and don't forget about the indoctrination that's embedded in the executive order itself,
Right.
right? Like they're going to create a patriotic curriculum in honor of the 250th anniversary of our country, which I mean, that's awesome, right? We've been at it for a long time. Hopefully we'll continue to be, but I'm not sure patriotic curricula is the way. I prefer hot dogs and fireworks. Thanks.
Same. Well, I want to move on to one more executive order before we move on to some of the federal and state bills. One of the other big executive orders that Trump has signed so far this term is on vouchers. And you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, Dena. So the executive order expanding educational freedom and opportunities for families was signed on January 29th. It directs the Secretary of Education to issue guidance on how state schools can use federal funds to support choice programs. So could you elaborate a little bit more on what this voucher executive order does?
I think good to set the tone of this little discussion. This is verbatim, almost verbatim out of Project 2025. It directs the Department of Education, so long as it exists, I say sarcastically, to develop guidance for states in the next 2 months on how they can use federal funding like Title I, which they receive from the federal government to help students from low income households, how they can kind of redirect funding to support vouchers. It also directs the Departments of Defense and Interior to develop plans for the schools that they operate, so the DoD schools and the Bureau of Indian Education schools, to push for vouchers. But, it's just another unrealistic attempt by Trump to direct the government to do things they don't have the power to do. During his first administration, Betsy DeVos, Secretary of Education, issued guidance calling for COVID relief money to be shared between public schools and private schools, but she had to walk it back. She didn't have the power to do that. And so Linda McMahon, if once she gets confirmed, won't have the power to do a lot of the things that are outlined in this executive order either. But any move for them in instructing them to dig deep in the rules and the way the programs are run and try to move money over to vouchers is certainly troubling.
Yeah, not to mention, and we've talked about this in many episodes, Rebecca, since the election. Again, this is just an example for those of you who are actually fans of democratic rule, the president trying to use executive power to do what nobody wants at the ballot box and is repeatedly being rejected by voters, which is steer money away from public schools and into private school voucher schemes, recently rejected in the November election in the 3 states where it was on the ballot, including some conservative states. Nobody wants this.
No, it was Kentucky, Nebraska, and Colorado. And then, interestingly, I've dug into the stats a little bit. In Kentucky and Nebraska, in 47 counties where they voted for President Trump by a 70+ point margin, they also rejected vouchers.
Wow.
Right. Right. Their own voters do not support these policies, but they're going to ram them down people's throats anyway.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
So there have been a lot of other executive orders that we do not have time to go over today, but I will just highlight them very, very quickly. Many of these executive orders deal with our friends in the LGBTQ plus community, and the impetus for these executive orders is religiously based. One of the orders that he recently signed came up with a definition of sex. This was something that happened on Inauguration Day. President Trump signed an executive order that was entitled Defending Women from Gender Ideology, Extremism, and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. So basically says that the United States has a policy that will recognize only two sexes, male and female, and that they are not changeable. Another one that President Trump signed in early February had to do with keeping men out of women's sports. So banning trans kids from playing sports. It said it is the policy of the United States to rescind all funds from educational programs that deprive women and girls of fair athletic opportunities, which results in the endangerment, humiliation, and silencing of women and girls and deprives them of privacy. And then along those same lines, there was an executive order on January 28th that Trump signed entitled Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutilation, which of course then touches on gender affirming care. And these are all issues that we've talked about at length on this show and will probably do so in the future because obviously the Supreme Court is considering the Scrimetti case that we talked about in a previous episode on gender affirming care. So these things will come up again in future episodes. But while we have you here, Dena, because of your legislative prowess, we really wanted to talk about some of the bills that are going on at the federal and state level. And one of them happens to be about vouchers, the Educational Choice for Children Act, affectionately known in our office as ECHA. So could you please explain a little bit more about ECHA?
Sure. It's a bill that's been introduced in the House and the Senate to create $100 billion private school voucher program. And because it's done through the tax code, which I can explain in a minute, it is eligible to be considered, or it's potentially on the table in the reconciliation bill that the Republicans are negotiating right now in the House and the Senate. It would give away $10 billion a year of federal taxpayer dollars to fund the first nationwide federal private school voucher program.
Can you just go back and explain what a reconciliation bill is in case our listeners don't know?
Sure. It is a bill that includes provisions that either reduce federal spending or increase federal spending. So think about tax cuts or tax increases. It's very tied to budget, and it also has special rules. And so that's why these really big things like Obamacare, the ACA passed through the budget reconciliation process because there are special rules around how many votes that it needs to get. So it becomes a very important way for parties in power to get through policies that they want that they couldn't ordinarily get through.
Basically, it's the only way any laws get made when our Senate is so evenly divided along partisan lines, because it's one of the only ways to pass legislation in the Senate that's not subject to the filibuster, which means it doesn't need the vote of 60 senators to get over the line. It just needs a bare majority, which is kind of all any party ever has in the Senate anymore. So the budget reconciliation bill is supposed to just be about things that involve the budget, taxing and spending, but ends up getting rolled into it whatever the party in charge can plausibly put into it to make policy, because it's going to be one of their only opportunities to pass things.
Exactly, exactly. And this actually does involve the tax code, so it is marginally possibly related, but let's hope
Right.
not.
But like a lot of voucher schemes, it involves tax credits and
Right,
or
exactly.
so-called scholarships, which are tax credits that can be used to offset the cost of private and mostly religious school attendance.
Right. So corporations and individuals under this bill would receive a dollar for dollar tax credit in exchange for giving money to an organization that gives out vouchers. So rather than collecting $10 billion per year in taxes, the federal government essentially transfers those tax dollars to give unlimited funding to students to attend private schools. An individual can claim a credit of up to 10% of their adjusted gross income, meaning that someone with $10 million of income, for instance, could receive a tax credit of up to $1 million per year.
Wow.
Yeah. And a corporation claim a credit of up to 5% of its taxable income.
Holy cow.
Yeah. It's a giant
Right.
program. Um
It's just a
yeah.
huge giveaway of taxpayer dollars to private religious schools, mostly religious schools. And in case you cut out a little bit when you were introducing this, Dean, I just want to point out this school voucher program is valued at 100 billion with a B dollars.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Liz. And I'm sure you've talked about before, vouchers have myriad problems. They don't work, they invite fraud and abuse, they fund discrimination, they harm rural schools, they undermine religious freedom. But this would be the first nationwide federal voucher program. So it imposes vouchers on states that don't already have these programs. Essentially, Congress is like overriding the will of the states.
And
Mhm.
Um,
as we just mentioned, the people, the individual voters who
exactly.
have roundly rejected these programs at the state level through direct democracy.
Mhm.
Since 1967, voters across the country have rejected voucher measures every time they've been on the ballot,
Wow.
which is 17 times in total.
Wow.
That's hard to do. Which just tells you, like, this is not some grassroots movement of parents and people that want better schools for their struggling inner city kids. This is all driven by special interests that want tax dollars for their parochial religious school industry.
Yes. And in fact, the billionaires who kind of back this voucher agenda across the country have really played a big role in a lot of state legislative races over the last few years. And there are states that have rejected vouchers in the legislature year after year after year who are going to vote to pass them this year because Republicans, especially rural Republicans who had heretofore opposed vouchers, lost their primaries and are no longer serving in the legislature.
What a shame. And again, if you're following along in your Project 2025 hymnals, straight from the Project 2025 playbook is expansion of private school vouchers. Really quickly, before we move on to just a quick rundown of state bills we're tracking, what about the Do No Harm Act? Remember the Do No Harm Act? The intent was a response to the wild expansion of RFRA and its intent and protections back in the Hobby Lobby days. So is the Do No Harm Act still a thing? Will it be reintroduced? Does it have any support?
It will definitely be reintroduced. So the Do No Harm Act is designed to preserve the good parts about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, right? It does provide important protections for religious exercise, but it clarifies that religious freedom can't be used to harm others. So it amends the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to ensure that no one misuses it to undermine civil rights laws, deny access to health care, thwart workplace protections, refuse to provide government funded services, kind of the things we've been talking about all afternoon. It will be reintroduced by the time this podcast airs. And, you know, let's be realistic. It is a Congress that is controlled by Republicans in the House and the Senate, but it's an opportunity to educate people on why this is important and be prepared for when the bill can move in the future. And also just explain what the principle is, right? Like the Do No Harm Act is essentially taking the Establishment Clause and ensuring the Establishment Clause protections apply to RFRA. And so anytime you can explain what the Constitution really means to people and talk to them about the bill and the principle is a good opportunity to do so.
Yeah. And again, it's combating that narrative or that inversion of the sword and the shield that we were talking about before, right? It's like you actually don't have a religious right to harm others. And that's all we're trying to preserve here.
Exactly.
And it is a bill that both of our organizations, Americans United and the Freedom from Religion Foundation, have supported in the past and will continue to do so. So let's move on to what's happening in the states. There's a lot of things happening in the states, and we're not going to be able to delve into all of the bills that we're seeing around the country. But I'd be interested to hear from you, Dena, what our teams are tracking.
Sure. A lot. But so I think we kind of look at certain categories. So religion in schools, there are 10 commandments bills in 27 states. And of course, there is a lawsuit that Americans United and Freedom from Religion Foundation are currently litigating on this in Louisiana, along with some of our other partners. There are bills to allow chaplains in public schools in 19 states. There are bills that involve student prayer or permitting student prayer in 8 states. There are bills talking about how students can get out of public schools to attend religious education during the school day in 8 states. And then there are countless voucher bills in states, and 3 states have enacted new voucher bills this year so far: Idaho, Wyoming, and Tennessee. And I think Texas is about to. Another bucket of bills that we track is the bills using religion as an excuse to harm others or discriminate. There are 18 bills related to healthcare. There are bills to create new state-level RFRAs, and there are 10 bills that are anti-LGBTQ plus bills. I think those are the main categories of what we are tracking. Both of our organizations are tracking more, but that's kind of the highlight
tone
or low light, as you might say.
Yeah, it's been a pretty brutal early legislative season in the states. There are huge lurches to the right on what so many of the state legislatures are emboldened to propose and to push the boundaries of what has been prior thought to be unconstitutional, like the 10 Commandments in schools, the anti-LGBTQ bills. Some of those include marriage bills, meaning states are pushing the boundaries of what was very recently held to be constitutionally guaranteed by the Supreme Court, which is undermining gay marriage rights. And so it's just a tough time, I think, in the state legislatures as well. There's a lot to monitor and agitate against.
Dena, I have to thank you so much for coming on the show today to demystify executive orders and talk at length about what we have been seeing. I know that our listeners are probably seeing all sorts of news and wondering, what does this mean? What impact does it have immediately on the lives of people that I care about or me personally? So we can't thank you enough for sharing your expertise with us today. So thank you so much for being on the show with us.
Thank you. I had a great time talking to you, Liz and Rebecca.
Ditto. We'll have to drag you back here sometime later in the year to talk about some of the legislative side things that we're fighting against.
Absolutely. So that is it for today's episode. I'm Rebecca Markert.
And I'm Liz Cavell. If you don't already, please be sure to check us out on our socials. We're on Twitter, we're on Blue Sky, we're on Facebook and Instagram. You can also find us online at we-dissent.org. and we'd love to hear how you're enjoying the show, so please also remember to leave us a review. Thanks for listening.
We Dissent is a joint production of the Freedom from Religion Foundation and Americans United for Separation of Church and State. It is hosted by attorneys Liz Cavell and me, Rebecca Markert. Other production support comes from Greta Martins. Audio engineering provided by Audio for the Arts based in Madison, Wisconsin. Thanks for listening.